it's a huge topic, and I think I'm at a faith-based institution, Loyola University Chicago, a Catholic Jesuit institution, and it was mentioned yesterday that a lot of the peace studies programs in the United States are indeed found at these faith-based institutions, and I'm in a theology department, and the theme of peace. I think what I want to say is those of us trained in the study of Islam, let's say in a Near East Studies department, especially those of us who have a personal interest in or commitment to Islam, I think find ourselves increasingly being called on to use our expertise in theological ways. And I think that's part of a kind of revitalization of Islamic theology to meet the needs and concerns of our contemporary period. And I think the interest in Islam and nonviolence and Islam and peace studies is part of that theological wave. And I'd just like to testify. I had the good fortune to be last week in Delhi, India, at the Jamia Millia Islamia, an academic-style university with a strong Islamic studies department and a lot of graduate students who've come through the madrasa system. And you know, there's really a strong interest in nonviolence and peace studies among these graduate students. There's a hunger, there's a cross-fertilization. So I met several students who had come from a madrasa background where they've been studying, and they all go online and they read the latest stuff. I mean, they're talking about Sherman Jackson's Islam in the Black American, Scott Kugel on gay theology, and Keisha Ali on women's studies. And you know, it's amazing how fast things are happening, at least in some parts of the Muslim world where there is access to materials in English and the internet. And I really anticipate a change coming, and I see especially something like Islamic peace studies meeting the needs of such individuals globally. So I think that some of the seeds that are sown, so our purpose in developing more in Islamic peace studies is to convince the public, you know, to alert the public and even our colleagues at our universities that there are Islamic voices for peace. That's part of the project. But I think we're also moving forward Muslim positions on these topics by these very efforts. So the themes of my presentation, as you've already read, I'm going to start off with problematizing, and it's a huge topic. And whenever you know, a lot of the stuff on Sufism, right? Sufism is nice and so on, but Sufism is complicated. So what is Sufism? How does it contribute to, or perhaps how does it complicate Islamic peace studies? And then one of the topics that I work on are Sufi movements in the West. And actually, some of the earliest writers in English on Islamic peace studies came out of the background of Sufi movements in America, so I can't resist referring to that. So first of all, imagine one is writing a book, right? I'm not going to be able to do that today, but let's imagine one is writing a book on the Sufi contributions or Sufi perspectives on peace. And the first thing is the classical Sufi tradition. What does that have to say about peace? Well, right off, we face a challenge. Peace studies is, after all, a modern field. You know, late 20th century, the travails, as was mentioned yesterday, of the West searching for peace, searching for peacemaking. So when you try to take non-Western materials or classical materials and bring them to bear on the challenges of peacemaking, you face a number of challenges. because you're not going to find a medieval text on Islam and peace written by a Sufi. So do you go through all the Sufi tafsirs, all the commentaries on the Quran? Clearly there's certain terms, there are certain verses. Nowadays we're lucky that so much of it is online and you can do some keyword searching and you can draw this out. But what terms do you look for? Or for example, the Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi. Let's say you look in Persian poetry for Sufi references to peace, and you find a way of pulling out. I actually tried to do this at an earlier stage of the paper. Every time the word salam was used in Rumi's Masnavi, well, it turns out almost 99% is salam alaikum, salawat on the prophets. It's not even a separate category. So that in itself is telling. So how do we excavate these terms and these concepts from the very, very classical tradition and try to make them relevant today? And why do we do that? Well, I think from an inside theological perspective, it's to show authenticity and continuity of this tradition. And in fact, even the material, let's say the material on the Mouridia in Senegal that we heard yesterday, you'll find echoes, you'll find precursors, I should say, to this colonial period and even modern Sufi discussions of peace. You will find precursors to that in the classical tradition. As I will try to illustrate with one very micro example, right? So it's always difficult to take apart a text on the run, but I couldn't resist sharing with you something that I found in the tafsir of SAHL AL-TUSTARI, one of the, or maybe the earliest extent, or one of the earliest one, maybe Sulami, I'm not sure, Sufi Quran commentaries. So first of all, not on the screen, there is Surah 49, verse 9, which is, if two parties of believers fall to fighting, then you, the believers, must make peace between them. Well, that's a very clear exhortation to peacemaking in the real world. However, the Sufi At-Tustari says, well, there's an outer meaning of the verse, and that's been explained. But the inner meaning refers to the spirit, the ruh, the intellect, the aql, the heart, the qalb, the basic elemental nature, desire. If natural instinct, desire, and lust take up arms against the heart, intellect, and spirit, the servant must fight them with the swords of vigilance, muraqabah, the arrows of inspection, mutala, and the lights of conformity, muwafqa, so that the spirit and the intellect gain the upper hand and desire and lust are vanquished. So you have this classical Sufi tradition taking outer peace and converting it to an inner psychological dimension. And you might say, well, does that mean that Sufis, are too inward-looking and they don't have anything? They don't want to look at that outer manifestation? Are they trying to balance both? And then I found this second one, fortunately, that Tustari is also willing to go from the inner to the outer. So it's not only going from the outer to inner, but there's also from the inner to the outer. For example, his tafsir of this verse, when you are offered a greeting, respond with a better one, or at least return it. He says, this means that you should surpass the greeting by acting with sincere friendship for God's sake. Exalted is he. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, peace, salam, is one of the names of God which he made manifest on earth. So spread it among yourselves. So here is the Sufi giving an exhortation to outward peacemaking in the same tafsir. So I'm just giving this as a micro example of how classical commentaries could be mined based on the content of specific verses, based on particular terminology to help us get, shall we say, a semantic and a theological background. So again, if we do this kind of excavation of tafsir or poetry, what are we actually proving about Sufism, about Islam? Because what I find is the theological dimension of the Sufi tradition lends itself to reflections on peace, but it also affirms its compatibility with all Islamic understandings of the Quran and tafsir. So one might also, one might say as well that this argues for a kind of re-inclusion of Sufism, because I would contend that in the modern period, Sufism is often under assault intellectually or even physically in various parts of the Muslim world. So kind of marginalized, this is not Islamic, we don't want to include this. So many of the earlier studies on Islam and nonviolence tended to focus on Sharia norms, Islamic positions on just war, and so on, and not really looking at that Sufi material, viewing it perhaps as something extrinsic. Okay, so that was one level of problematization. How do we use the classical Sufi tradition? The second level is Sufis, as speaking to peace studies, can we possibly fall into the trap of portraying Sufis as the good, peaceful Muslims? And I think many of us are aware of how that was deployed in American foreign policy, especially after 9/11. I'm going to give you some examples, and using some of the modern stuff gives me a chance to put in some visuals here. So I'll have some images in a minute. But it's not just in the West, but in various Muslim societies, you have governments convening Sufi conferences and saying if we promote our local Sufi heritage, it's going to be a deterrent to radicalization. So that puts the Sufis in an awkward position. Are they going to be, you know, kind of share in that patronage and say, yes, promote us because we're really the good Muslims? Then what does it say about Sufis' relationship to other Muslims? So some of you may be aware of the various reports, the RAND reports, the Nixon Center reports that were issued, let's say, between 2003, 2007, where it was portrayed that there was a struggle for the soul of Islam between syncretic Sufism and fundamentalism, and it's sort of portraying the Sufis are those Muslims who feel that they don't have to follow the Sharia, it's non-essential, they are more rational. So a kind of misrepresentation of Sufism and taking it up. So on the one hand, you have Wahhabi or extremist positions that say Sufism is not part of Islam. Now you're hearing a kind of echo of that in American foreign policy making. And then as I'm going to give some of the examples from India and Pakistan of patronage for Sufis on the part of the Indian and Pakistani governments. So much of this kind of Sufis as the good Muslims reports that were issued in the West continue the stereotypes of the colonial period, that somehow Sufism is not originally Islamic and that's why it's good. You know, it has a lot of Christian influence or Eastern influences. That Sufis are free thinkers and so we can identify with them and they're more ready to move into modernity. That Sufis are apolitical. Well, all serious scholarship on Sufism immediately debunks these kind of positions by demonstrating the Quranic basis of Sufism. We saw yesterday that, in fact, a number of Sufis were leaders of movements during the colonial struggle, so they certainly haven't always been apolitical when required, and that so many of the Sufis were themselves jurists. So here's where I get to do the visuals. And during that period, Shaykh HISHAM KABBANI was featured on a lot of the neocon talk radio. He's our good moderate Muslim who's a good exemplar. He spoke at that State Department forum. He was an advisor on how to counter extremism. So it's not only Western policymakers who have positioned Sufism in that way, but some Sufis themselves have taken on the mantle of being the representation. So our other more recent example is Dr. Tahir al-Qadri from Pakistan, a somewhat controversial figure, but having a large following who's large following in Pakistan and even globally in the movement Minhaj al-Quran. And this is one of he issued the 600-page fatwa against terrorism. He's written on Islam and peace. He has the peace, de-radicalization and counterterrorism curriculum, which is a long list of his own books, which are compilations from the hadith collections and various fatwa. The Pakistan government under Musharraf established in 2006 a National Sufi Council, and then later in 2009 this was renamed as the Sufi Advisory Council. Some of the main initiatives of these councils were to promote Sufi music and ideas as a counterweight to extremism. It was suggested that every university in Pakistan should have a department of a PhD program in Sufi studies, television programs, some of them actually quite good, featured Sufi music from the various regions of Pakistan, but all of this was ostensibly to help Pakistanis recover their true artistic heritage and thereby to promote peace. Of course, at the same time, that made people in certain quarters suspicious of Sufism and kind of delegitimized the Sufis at another level, right? So it's, again, this kind of conundrum or tension of where the Sufis would position themselves. So the SINDH government in Pakistan, where there are a number of Sufi shrines, you may know recently one of the shrines, Lal Shahbaz calendar, was bombed by extremists. So all of this is, going on in a very fraught context of potential violence. And the sort of top-down, I know yesterday we were talking about the state and Sufism. This problematizes the role of the state getting involved in deciding to side with the Sufis. So this is the title of an article from Dawn newspaper in Pakistan last April, speaking about the Sufi conference. And here you have an Indian filmmaker, intellectual, Muzaffar Ali, and the famous Sufi singer, Abida Parveen, talking about culture. And also another theme of these initiatives during this period in Pakistan was trying to promote peace between India and Pakistan. So you can see some noble kind of Sufic type objectives, but also the, if you will, perhaps contamination or suspicion that was engendered by the aspect of government support. Also in 2016, on the other side of the border in India, there was a World Sufi Forum attended by Mashayikh, Sufi leaders, ulama from India, and also Dr. Tahir al-Qadri from Pakistan. And one of the sort of political highlight of the conference was an address by the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, speaking about the peaceful nature of Sufism and its role in Indian history. Sufism is the essence of Islam in India. Sufis love their nation. Sufism is a celebration of diversity and pluralism. Every people has its own path of truth, beliefs, and focus of reverence. So the Indian national narrative is including Sufism or valorizing Sufism. At the same time, of course, there's a suspicion because Modi came up through the right-wing Hindutva pro-Hindu movements, so the other Muslims of India would be a bit put off by this kind of promotion of Sufism. So now I'm going to shift, okay? So that was the political problematization of Sufis in peace studies. In some of my work on Muslim theologians of nonviolence, I looked at the type of arguments that were made to undergird nonviolent approaches to Islamic interpretation, and I sorted them into three main categories. First of all, if you will, the theological or spiritual metaphysical approaches to excavating a nonviolent theology. Secondly, juristic approaches, rulings on peacemaking, the rules of jihad. And finally, an approach taken by many contemporary Muslims writing on nonviolence is a rereading of the Sunnah and the Sirah, kind of historical, right, looking back at Muslim history, either in the period of the Prophet or other times of peaceful coexistence, such as Muslim Spain, the Ottoman Empire. And I think we could see in the presentation on the Muridiya and Ahmadu Bamba yesterday that this this kind of rereading of the battle narratives, for example, in the time of the Prophet, have they been excessively emphasized? Has the merciful element of his life been reduced? So the first of these categories, the theological and spiritual, these are general Muslim approaches to nonviolent theology in which Sufis participate. So invoking the idea of as-salam as one of the divine names, that Allah's mercy encompasses all, outweighs his wrath, Jamali, or the beautiful, gentle qualities in the divine names, that tranquility is a high Islamic principle, that the normal state of human nature is to desire to be in a state of balance and justice. These are all part of the Islamic framework, not necessarily specifically Sufis, but Sufis participate in articulating such theologies. Secondly, the juridical, I would say this is the category where we might, expect less direct Sufi discourse, and yet it is there. As we heard, Sufi re-evaluations of the inner jihad, but of course that's taking it away from the purely legal. And then the rereading of Islamic history, stressing the merciful nature of the Prophet, the peaceful surrender of Mecca, and looking at the Meccan period. This is like the second message of Islam, Sufi approach, looking at the Meccan chapters as the more timeless and universal ones, so that references to a battle or enemies or so on from the Medinan period can be seen as relevant to that time only, and not necessary throughout all periods. So, as I said at the beginning, part of the interest in a topic such as Islamic peace studies is a revival of Islamic theology. And this is not only emerging from the needs and questions of our time that were not addressed in the past, but because there are new contexts for Muslims to study and articulate theology, both in the Muslim world and in the West. So, for example, in the Germanic universities where there are departments of theology that often train teachers who would teach in Catholic schools or Protestant schools, many of these universities have opened faculties of Islamic theology. So it's a new form of Islamic studies in those contexts, part of which is driven by the state that sees that this kind of formal university training is going to prepare Muslim teachers and ultimately the Muslim community for, shall we say, better integration in their society. So again, we can problematize it, but we can also say that its effect could be salutary in encouraging and supporting Muslims to rethink their tradition in a way that addresses these new topics and concerns from a Muslim perspective. And then in Muslim societies, of course, in some of the more creative thought is being done in Turkey, where you have faculties of theology that had been established by the Turkish government to replace the kind of madrasa training for preachers and scholars. And so you have a very creative Turkish, if you will, liberal theology that addresses questions of women's rights, peace studies, pluralism, and so on. You have the initiatives of female scholars such as the Murshidat in Morocco and the Wazat in Turkey. So all of this is part of a sea change occurring across the globe in Islamic theology. So what are some issues raised by Sufi approaches to peace studies? So these are things that we can discuss ultimately. Are Muslim societies influenced by Sufism more peaceful? When I heard the presentation on Senegal yesterday, I started to think that that might be a thesis. Of course, we started talking about counterexamples like Turkey, South Pakistan, countries that had traditionally a very high public participation in Sufism, that Sufi Islam was considered to be the main form of religiosity in Pakistan, but clearly we face challenges to peace in that society in terms of intra-Muslim violence, in India communal riots, conflict between various interpretations of Islam. So what has gone on in those societies that seems to have overridden the Sufi background? Sufis in South Asia are celebrated for their strong engagement with local cultural traditions. For example, the Chishti order is known to use music and poetry in its ceremonies. The Sufis of South Asia, like those of Africa, have spread Islam through service to the poor, feeding the needy, charity. The Sufis are famous for, in some cases, accepting even Hindu disciples. People of all religious backgrounds visit the Sufi shrines in South Asia. But when it comes to the discussion of are Sufis staying away from the political rulers and leadership, some of the Sufi orders, such as the Chishtis, said that one must practice bu'd as-salatin, avoid and stay away from the rulers, whereas we know historically that many of the Naqshbandis intermarried with the royal families, participated in the courts, got large land grants. So it's kind of what does it mean to have a society influenced by Sufism? It works at different ways, different levels, and it does not guarantee, I would argue, a peaceful result. Can Sufi psychology be a resource for Islamic peace studies? So the Sufis are the ones who most elaborated concepts such as the inner jihad, rising up through different levels of the ego or the nafs to reach the contented soul. And I would say if you look and again, I did this kind of term search in some of the Sufi literature looking for the term salam, and not finding so much discussion of salam, but a lot more discussion of suluh, achieving reconciliation or peacemaking seemed to be the opposite of war rather than the term salam. So this rather complicated diagram is something that I drew from a Sufi I worked on extensively, Shah Waliullah of Delhi. He lived in the 1700s, so an 18th century figure. And what I would present this as a Sufi psychological model that informs us about the Sufi understanding of achieving peace. So basically, and it's actually rather compatible with the passage from Tustari's tafsir that I read before that mentions the heart and the intellect and the physical elements of the person. So the Sufi view, in brief, is that at the lowest level of these three diagrams, so there's a movement of the circles from the lowest of the physical constituents of the body, then the second, it's sort of where heaven meets earth, right? So the earth is the elemental level, then the human person is mediating the two of them, and these centers of the heart, the ruh, and so on are at the middle. These two lower levels are arenas of conflict. Suluh, the challenges that need to be overcome by Sufi practices of asceticism, meditation, overcoming desire, control, and so on. Once that conflict has been resolved at the lower level, then the individual is open to the, if you will, the effusions, the visions, the inspiration from the highest level, which is what would be the level of salam, peace, the nafs al-mutma'inna, the sakina. So the Sufi view is not of, if you will, peace without effort. Peace takes effort to overcome the conflicts of this world, both within one's own nature and within the outer realm. So that's the Sufi psychological contribution, which is, of course, reflects the later Sufi debate about fana versus baqa. So fana is the erasure of the self, so to be in touch with that ultimate level of peace. But baqa is reflecting that, you know, that peace can be achieved once the struggle and conflict has been overcome. So the challenge is, okay, the individual Sufis may overcome that and achieve peace personally. How can they transfer that to the society as a whole? Is monistic theology inherently more peaceful? So if everything is one and the divine is reflected in all things, you can tolerate multiple perspectives, be open to all religions, tolerate ambiguity. But some Sufi groups in the Akbarian tradition, i.e. the tradition of Ibn Arabi, despite the discourse of love, may become quite authoritarian and hierarchical. So in other words, monism or mysticism is not by itself necessary. You know, it's peace on our terms. You know, peace if you accept that this is the way God wants it to be hierarchical. You stay in your place. You don't rebel. And that is, of course, part of the classical Muslim synthesis. So Sufi humanism, is it conducive to peace? That's another question to put on the table. Love and respect for shared humanity. We heard that yesterday about the teachings of the African Sufis. I'm reminded of Rumi's poem of the reed flute, right? The same divine breath is flowing through all of us. We are all in this human condition lamenting, yet we are all in the path of returning to God. So this lays the path to mutual respect and a peaceful view. Later Sufism is also humanistic in the sense that the human being can change his or her own destiny. So Shah Waliullah speaks, of course, in kind of Platonic idealistic terms, that we as human individuals who achieve peace and closeness to God are ultimately having a salutary effect on the form of the entire human species. In other words, we as human beings can get better. The universe can get better. So you have a hopeful theology as opposed to everything's going to hell in a handbasket on the way to the last days. So that can be a humanistic positive contribution towards peace. I have here a later Sufi-influenced couplet from the Pakistani poet Iqbal. Develop yourself so that even before the divine decree comes, God will ask you, what, O human being, do you desire? So a hopeful view. Sufism is part of the humanistic tradition in Islam. What have we lost in modernity with the rejection of Sufism? Is it only about Sharia norms that we know something to be Islamic? Have we lost the Persianate tradition, in, for example, in Turkey, in India, that source of ethics? Have we lost poetry and art among Muslims? So humanism in the sense of elevating the human person, but also the humanities of a source of Islamic values. It used to be that one had the transmitted knowledge interpreted in Sharia terms, the use of intellectual argument, and visions, as we heard yesterday, disclosures on the part of the Sufis as sources of truth and reality. That has dropped out in modernity. What have we lost? And what is Sufism? There are all kinds of flavors of Sufism: popular, New Age, authenticity. I see my time is running very short. Can I just quickly talk about Guru BAWA and Rob? I thought I would have way too little to say. Let me just quickly flag two contributors to Islamic Peace Studies among the Western Sufis. Guru BAWA MOHIYUDDEEN, the Sinhalese from Sri Lanka Sufi who died in 1986. Islam and World Peace is compiled from lectures he gave in the 1970s, drawing on the classical tradition. So kind of an very pioneering and undervalued work, drawing on classical themes like many other theologians of nonviolence. We are in a new time. Human beings are capable of destroying themselves. Hence, the work of peace is very, very urgent. BAWA also talks about problems in the real world, needing to solve the conflict in the Middle East. Remember, this is the 70s. I mean, things have become much more messed up. But there are a number of Western Sufis in the 70s who took on the project of Jerusalem, and seeing Jerusalem as the heart of the world and the need to heal that, including Sam Lewis, the American Sufi from Berkeley. So these are just some of the terms of some of the themes in BAWA's book, and I'm not going to read them in the interest of time. I'm going to mention one final example, Rabia Terry Harris, who was also mentioned yesterday, an American woman who has founded the Muslim Peace Fellowship, who has written on the need for peace. She came out of the Helveti Cirahi, hybrid Turkish order that came to America. Sheikh Muzaffar Ozak, advocating nonviolent Sufi theology. And this particular Sufi order has also undertaken practical projects of feeding the poor, aid to Afghanistan, trying to promote peace in the Balkans. So new Muslim theologies of nonviolence are not only looking at the outer, but also looking at violence within families, gender violence, As I mentioned, we're now in a global theological sphere of Muslim theology, and Muslim theologians are in much stronger conversation with all kinds of academic, social sciences, and philosophical approaches. I think the promise and challenge of Islamic peace studies is that it offers hopefulness and an internal critique. It's clearly a modern approach, and I think the Sufi contributions will mainly be in the sphere of the theological and potentially the practical. Thank you.
So the presentation, thank you very much for your presentation, is now open to questions. We have some 15 minutes for that, right? And then we'll have a coffee break. Please feel free to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for your presentation. Is the microphone on?
Yeah, it's now on.
No, it's on. It's on now? Okay. Turn on the volume. Thank you very much for your presentation. One of the questions you asked at the towards the end is, what is Sufism? How do you define it? And perhaps one can link that to the potential for peacemaking that you are exploring in your study of Sufism. There's quite a famous statement by a Sufi to the effect, rather teasing, as Sufi language can be rather nimble and sinewy and teasing. Formally, this is the statement. Formally, Sufism is a reality without a name. Mm-hmm. And today, Sufism is a name without a reality. Al-Haq bidun al-ism. Mm-hmm. And in that respect, Sufism seems like a moving target. Mm-hmm. And if so, what is its potential for peacemaking? Is it more methodological, or is it more teleological, end-oriented? And the nafs mutma'inna that you cited from Surah 83 of the Quran also has in the same chapter the idea of the nafs lawama, the self-accusing itself. It's a kind of awareness of what is wrong with the self. So my question is really, what is the potential for peace in the Sufi materials you're looking at, both in terms of methodology and the end game?
Thank you very much for that great question. I think that part of the, what I'm struggling with is trying to think this through. For example, the Sufi tafsirs is that they really are so embedded, in other words, from a Sufi point of view, Sufism is already there. Sufism is Islamic. It's not a separate thing. And of course, we had reference yesterday, and the reference is always given about Sufism to the Hadith of Gabriel, right? Islam, Iman, Ihsan. They go together. Sufism is not something else out there. Now, of course, with New Age Sufism, if I may refer to these categories on the slide, New Age Sufism is often Sufism without the Islamic part, right? Non-Sharia compliant. That Sufism is some kind of a universal spiritual search, and anyone who feels that urge is a Sufi. So that wouldn't be helpful, perhaps, to this kind of project, if I can put it that way. But then authenticity Sufism, that's my term. I say that the growth edge, really in global Sufism, and especially in Sufism in the West, is a Sufism that has a very strong emphasis on the Islam part, knowing fiqh, belonging to a madhab, being formed in that kind of, if not an actual madrasa somewhere in the Muslim world, at least some kind of imagined madrasa here of a deen intensive, or, there's a kind of embodied authenticity of the tradition that I think a lot of Muslims are looking for today. And the Sufi challenge there is, or the challenge to Sufis, are they part of that? Does that authenticity include Sufism? And I think part of the a certain change we see among the cohort of young Muslims in North America is the shift from kind of movement Islam identification in the 1990s to the authenticity Islam that includes some kind of adab or personal transformation. As one Sufi teacher, Habib al-Jifri says, it's not what you know, it's who you are. But in order to become who you are, there is a path of knowledge. But if the knowledge you have doesn't change you, then it's not that kind of knowledge. Now, I'm not sure if that, I'm not saying, hey, that's the greatest and that's where we're going to end up. But I think it is a recovery of some of the aspects that we heard about yesterday of that kind of embodied, embodied Sufism that is part of Islam, but it is a formation that includes certain practices and techniques of changing the person. Now, I think the other part of your question is, so then how does that do anything about making the world better? Right? So in other words, having the humanities there or listening to beautiful music or perhaps making people more sensitive. It reminds me a little bit about the conversation that we're going to be having as the humanities get cut more and more at the universities here. Right? Like, what is the purpose of a humanistic formation in making a person, whether religion, making a person a human, and Sufism seemed to touch those elements in Islamic civilization. But you can sort of say, well, this is, sometimes you can, but a beautiful song or a wonderful miniature painting or some calligraphy or modern experiments that draw on that tradition. So I'm not what would you, a traditionalist. I don't, and this is part of the Sufi debate, right? So there's one Sufi position that we now live in a fallen modern world. And in the fallen modern world, you can never have authentic spirituality unless you somehow transport yourself or, move your head around or imagine that you're living in a traditional way. Now, I would say that horse is out of the barn. So if Sufism is going to speak to the needs of our time, Sufi positions, I don't think that traditional, again, I would say you have to find a way to make music now. You have to find a way to make that tradition speak to the soul of people in our age. Again, that's one piece. Does that mean that it's going to make your society better? To humanize people. But I think part of the Sufi voice is, yes, these repeated themes, right? The common humanity, seeing the beauty, that kind of opening up the heart and sympathy. It may sound rather hokey, but without that, how can one step out to try and make things better on other levels?
Other questions, comments? If there are no comments, I would love to say just a few words about my vision of the problem of Sufism and peace studies. I think there can be many approaches. Mine would be more historical, probably, than discursive. What is unique about Sufism, and Marcia knows this better than anyone, because she has studied Sufism all her life, there are the tradition is extremely rich, and it offers many role models, from peaceniks to fighting monks. For instance, if we look, we find the Sufi martyrs who died fighting for the cause of Islam on the borders of between the Muslim empire, the growing Muslim empire in the Abbasid period, and say pagan Turks. Shaykh al-Balkhi was one such individual who died in the Transoxania area fighting the Turks. Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, who is also appropriated by Sufis, although he may not have been a fully fledged Sufi, because he was active when the term Sufism had not yet appeared as a denomination. So, but he was appropriated by Sufis, again, a fighter who can have a tranquility in the battlefield, to have a nap during the fight with the Byzantiums, but then wake up and fight on. Funded his military effort by his trade, by his commercial transactions. Then Ibrahim ibn Adham, who also died on a campaign, military campaign, on board a ship, fighting against the Byzantium fleet, and so forth. So then we can look at Bektashiya, who were part of the army corps under the Ottomans, who were actually commissars to some extent, used drums to kind of work the army into the fighting mood. And then on the other side, we find complete peaceniks, like today's, well, you mentioned Özak, then Gülen, Shaykh HISHAM, KABBANI, who all preach tolerance, peace, and so forth. So, but their approach to the Sufi tradition is very selective. The question about what Sufism can contribute today, I think it can contribute organizational structure. The Sheikh-Murid relations it's a very potent social political mechanism. This Sheikh can have his students vote for a certain party. Just tell them, vote for this candidate. And this happens in the Sudan and in other areas of Africa today, in Senegal also. And in Yemen, I can also add that. So, in other words, Sufis offer many, it's like a toolbox for a person to choose from. You can identify with militant Sufis, you can identify with absolutely otherworldly Sufis who had withdrawn from society and lived on top of the mountains and in the caves, or you can identify with Sufis who are active in promoting moral ethical reform. And I think those who are promoting moral ethical reform are the most promising in terms of, and especially if they use this organizational structure of the Sufi Brotherhood, which is very potent, as I say, and can be very effective in achieving mundane goals, not just otherworldly goals. That I'm sorry that if I kind of.
But of course, one of the challenges that the traditional sort of charisma of these Sufi leaders in many cases has been watered down into what we might call, or what I call, post-Tariqa Sufism. You know, so something like the Gülen movement or the Nur movement, you don't, I mean, you know, it becomes much more diffuse. So it seems to be working in terms of a social mobilization, but it doesn't seem to have that transformative, you know, how do you, again, it's part of the challenge of modernity, right, and changing social formations.
There are allegations that was deployed in the coup.
I do think that ethical component you refer to is important. Also that guidance and the behavior of the novices following the directions of the murshid or, you know, the sheikh is very, very important. So I think what I'm looking for is a form of commitment to peacemaking, if not to pacifism, but to peacemaking that develops from the methods of contemplation, application, obedience, and so forth and so on. That attachment, the Murids exemplify this to some extent, that attachment to the Shaykh is also attachment to a work culture, and therefore there is an order and a discipline involved in the membership of the order, which expresses itself politically without looking for a theocratic expression of the Sufi fidelity. But thank you very much. I think that's very helpful.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, we have time for 2 more questions. Yeah, first, Professor Naeem.
Yes, actually, of course, I'm very familiar with this discourse in relation to Sudan over the last 30, 40 years, where Sufi tariqas and traditions have been co-opted by all sorts of political projects. And I think the problem is precisely that, the co-optability of Sufism and is instrumentalization of Sufi values and structures is what really disturbing for me personally, as someone who feels that probably Sufism is the best of Islam, but the way that it has lent itself or rendered itself co-optable. And again, the decline of the Sufi leadership, so that they don't have an agenda of their own. They are sort of minimalist agenda, but sort of ready for almost Top Gun type of relationship with politicians and political or ideological, like the Muslim Brotherhood leader like Hassan al-Turabi and military leader like Numeri. So that is, I think, what is problematic in this instrumentalist, co-optive search for what tools in the box do I look for.
Thank you. There's one more question, and then I think we'll have the coffee break.
Hi, thanks so much. So my apologies in advance. I came partway through your presentation, so it's possible you talked about this and I missed it. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the notion of a just peace or a positive peace that Rashid Omar talked about in the context of Sufi traditions and views on that, where the question is coming from. The Sufi Muslim who I know best isn't a scholar or someone who's well known. He's a man named Azim Khamisa in San Diego who's a practicing Sufi Muslim, and his son was killed in a random drive-by shooting, and he forgave the shooter, who was a teenager, became very close friends with the shooter's family and with this kid, and they're very active in restorative justice and movements in San Diego that are looking at addressing structural violence and root causes of conflict within the inner city. And he talks often about how his Sufi practice and Sufi beliefs influence his commitment to this sort of structural violence-focused activism.
Yes, thank you for that beautiful example. I actually remember that story because I used to live in San Diego, and of course that's built on Sufi principles, right? Because the ego, the move would not be to want revenge, right? It would be to want the greater good or the transformation. And as I recall, the Sufi is actually seeing the other youth as a victim, right? The shooter is also a victim. So being able to make that completely unselfish move of empathy. So, I mean, of course, that would be the ideal, right? That would be the transformed person who is able to make that kind of difference and also take on that kind of leadership. And ideally, Sufi values would, lead to that kind of just or positive peace. But of course, the bar is very high to take that on. So thank you for that beautiful example.
Thank you, Professor Hermansen, for your
Thank you all.
presentation. Thanks everyone for your answers and comments.